Welcome back. In this lecture, we will examine user-to-data bias. Here's our lesson objective. Okay, so looking back at our paradigm, biased data can affect algorithms, causing them to have biased results. But even with unbiased data, a biased algorithm can affect the user. But finally, biased behavior on the user can affect the data that we use in machine learning. And that is where we get into user-to-data bias. So certain applications, especially getting into social media, web search, advertising, they're using user-created data to train models. So if the users creating that data have some bias, now that bias becomes baked into that data set that is used. And so whether these biases are pre-existing in society or maybe they came from how the user interacts with another bias system, it almost doesn't matter, because if they have that bias, regardless of where it came from, this is the entry point into where, that bias entering our data. And, we have spoken in this course about things like reinforcement learning and looking at reinforcement learning models that consider user behavior. That's a big place where this kind of bias can end up emerging. So let's look at a couple examples. So first is historical bias, and this happens when a pre-existing bias in the population leads to user-generated data that possesses that bias. And so if you're building a data set based on people's opinions about something, and the particular group has certain racial or ethnic leanings or political leanings that may end up being represented in the underlying data that results. Population bias. This occurs when the data being derived from a given group of people does not reflect the population as a whole. This frequently occurs in social media, and there are some well-known stats about the demographics of people who use different social media platforms. And so if you do something on Facebook, collecting data there, it's likely that women will be overrepresented as opposed to Reddit, where you'll probably have overrepresentation of men. Self-selection bias. This one is really common, especially in things like political surveys, where the people who volunteer to give information that's used in a particular data set are doing so because they're motivated for some other reason. And what happens is, if people are motivated for some underlying reason, then that data set will become conditioned on that reason. And again, the canonical example is people really excited about a given political candidate come out and vote, or come out and respond to a survey, but they might not be representative of the voter population as a whole, and so your political survey would then be skewed. So social bias is a really interesting one, and we've actually studied this a lot here at ASU. And this occurs when a user's contribution to the data set is influenced by other people. And you can think of examples of this as being like, well, I'm about to give a company a really bad review on Yelp, but then I see many other people gave it good reviews, and I moderate my input. I give it a higher score than I was originally intending because I looked at what the other people did. We have seen over and over again studies about social influence where, based on the number of connections adopting a certain behavior or opinion, this individual in the middle is more likely going to take similar actions. And we have seen this in human subjects tests, where when an individual is connected in a social network with a certain number of other people, its likelihood of taking on a new behavior when there are a small number of signals is much lower than if there are influencers for that person providing multiple signals. Next is behavioral bias. And this occurs when behavior changes for a specific platform, context, or data set. And one example here is emojis. So on your phone, if you are an Android user, emojis look different than if you're an iPhone user. And there's actually been studies that have shown that people react differently to the same emoji depending on if it's delivered on what platform it's delivered by. And this could create, misunderstandings, but if you're looking at stuff from a data-centric standpoint, it could be that the interpretation of the communication on that platform ends up being very different. Temporal bias, and this arises from changes in population behavior over time, and a great example of this is hashtag use in Twitter. A given hashtag, a topic is often discussed well in advance of the hashtag becoming popular, and it's often discussed well in the aftermath of that hashtag ceasing to be popular. So using the hashtag as a way to measure popularity has some issues, and that is a form of temporal bias. Next is content production bias, and so this is the idea that people who produce content, things like tweets and videos and so forth online, they have certain characteristics that relate to their demographics, particularly things like language and age, that cause major differences, and not only for them as individuals, but in the audience that they're trying to communicate to. So this concludes our lecture. Please stay tuned for more content.